black girl faced humiliation and threats from a racist sheriff, no one expected things to change in an instant. But that's exactly what happened when Tom Cruise showed up. His intervention was a turning point that shook everyone around him. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching us from. The sun hung low in the Alabama sky, baking the cracked asphalt and casting long shadows across the empty road. Heat shimmered in the distance, blurring the horizon, and the sound of cicadas filled the air with a steady, droning hum. Kesha Williams adjusted the straps of her faded pink backpack and tugged at the hem of her black t-shirt. The bold white letters spelling out Black Lives Matter seemed to glow in the unforgiving sunlight, making her feel exposed. Still, she held her head high. At 14, Kesha had learned to walk with purpose, even when her stomach churned and her hands trembled. She had learned that fear was not something she could let others see. Not here, not in this town. The grocery store wasn't far now. She could see its flickering neon sign ahead, the kind that buzzed quietly and always seemed one strong wind away from going dark for good. The parking lot was half empty, save for a few rusted pickup trucks and a battered SUV. She shifted her backpack, feeling the dampness of sweat where the straps dug into her shoulders. She told herself she could do this. Kesha wasn't the type to shy away from challenges. She had grown up watching her mother fight for everything they had: food, shelter, and respect, and she had inherited that same unyielding spirit. She pictured her mother's weary face as she headed off to her second shift at the diner and thought about the stack of unpaid bills sitting on their kitchen counter. But today wasn't about bills. Today was about keeping the family fed. Kesha's younger sisters, ages 6 and 8, were waiting at home. She could almost hear their excited voices as they rummaged through the bags she was about to bring back. That thought gave her strength. The heat was relentless. She wiped the sweat from her forehead and glanced to her left. Parked along the side of the road, just past the bend near the gas station, was a black and white patrol car. Her heart skipped a beat. Sheriff Roy Harper. The car's windows were tinted, but she could feel his eyes on her. She didn't need to see them to know. It was the same stare she had felt so many times before, from clerks in stores, from neighbors who looked too long, from teachers who spoke down to her as if she weren't smart enough to understand. Kesha kept walking, forcing her feet not to falter. Don't look. Don't stop. Don't give him a reason. But her stomach twisted, and the memory hit her like a punch. Her brother Jamal. The flashing red and blue lights, the shouts, her mother screaming. Jamal had been 17. 2 years older than Kesha was now. He'd been walking home from basketball practice when a cop decided he fit the description. Jamal never made it home. The officer claimed he'd seen a weapon. There hadn't been one. The investigation dragged on for months, but nothing came of it. Kesha blinked hard, forcing the memory away. She couldn't think about Jamal now, not here. She tightened her grip on the straps of her backpack. The patrol car didn't move, but she saw a flicker of motion through the windshield. Harper was there. She knew it. Everyone in town knew Sheriff Roy Harper. He was a man who wore his authority like armor, and he had made it clear more than once that he didn't tolerate troublemakers. Kesha had heard the whispers about him, the stories of intimidation, the rumors about missing evidence and mysteriously dropped charges when his deputies were involved. But no one ever did anything. Kesha swallowed hard. The grocery store was only 100 feet away now. She could make it. She reached the entrance and pushed through the heavy glass door. Inside, the store was dim and cool, the fluorescent lights humming faintly. Shelves were lined with dented cans and off-brand snacks. A small refrigerated section in the back held a few gallons of milk and cartons of eggs. Kesha moved quickly, her eyes darting from the shelves to the clerk behind the counter. The woman, white with gray hair pulled into a tight bun, watched her without smiling. Kesha ignored the look. She had seen it too many times before to care. She grabbed a loaf of bread, a carton of eggs, and a small jug of milk, then made her way to the counter. The clerk scanned the items in silence. That it? Kesha nodded and pulled a few crumpled bills from her pocket. The woman's eyes lingered on her t-shirt before finally taking the money and handing her the change. Kesha stuffed the bills into her pocket, grabbed her bag, and left without another word. The heat hit her again as she stepped outside. She took a deep breath and looked toward the road. Harper's car was still there. She felt her pulse quicken. He hadn't moved. Was he waiting for her? Kesha forced herself to keep walking, her steps steady, but the patrol car's engine rumbled to life. Her stomach dropped. The car pulled away from the curb and rolled slowly down the street, shadowing her as she walked. She felt the eyes again, that predatory stare drilling into her back. Kesha's grip tightened around the bag in her hand. Her heart raced, but she didn't stop. She kept walking. The sound of tires crunching on gravel grew louder as Harper's car eased into the parking lot. She was almost to the gas station now. If she could just make it past there, she'd be in the clear. But then the car stopped. The driver's side door creaked open. Kesha didn't look back, but she heard the heavy thud of boots hitting the ground. Her throat tightened. She quickened her pace, but before she could take another step, his voice rang out behind her. "Hey, girl, hold up." Kesha froze. The sun pressed down, the heat wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. She turned slowly, her pulse pounding in her ears. Sheriff Roy Harper stood there, towering and broad, his mirrored sunglasses reflecting the light. He crossed his arms, his badge catching the sun. A slow smile spread across his face. "Where are you headed in such a hurry?" Kesha clutched the bag tighter, her knuckles turning white. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The road stretched behind her, empty and endless. And she knew this wasn't over. Kesha's fingers tightened around the handle of her grocery bag as Sheriff Roy Harper took a slow step closer. The heat shimmered off the pavement behind him, distorting the edges of his broad frame. His mirrored sunglasses reflected the image of a small, frightened girl standing alone on the cracked asphalt. "Asked you a question," Harper said, his voice low but sharp, each word snapping like a whip. "Where you headed?" Kesha's throat felt dry. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her heart thudded in her chest, pounding so hard it almost hurt. "Home," she managed to whisper. "Home," Harper repeated, dragging out the word as if testing its weight. He reached up and adjusted the brim of his hat, his other hand resting casually near the holster on his belt. Kesha's eyes flicked to the gun, then back to his face. He didn't move, but his stance radiated authority. Power. She could hear her mother's voice echoing in her head. "Don't argue. Don't make it worse." "Mind if I see what's in the bag?" Harper asked. Kesha flinched, stepping back instinctively. I paid for it," she said quickly, her voice trembling. She fumbled with the receipt in her pocket, pulling it out and holding it toward him. "Here, I have the receipt." Harper didn't take it. Instead, he glanced down at the crumpled paper and smirked. "Paid for it, huh?" He let the words hang in the air, heavy and doubting. "I'll be the judge of that." Before Kesha could react, he reached out and snatched the bag from her hand. "Hey!" Kesha's voice rose, panic bubbling up as she grabbed for the bag, but Harper stepped back, holding it just out of reach. "Watch your tone," he said, his voice dropping lower, more dangerous. "Don't get yourself in more trouble than you're already in." Tears burned at the corners of Kesha's eyes, but she blinked them back. She couldn't cry. Not here. Not in front of him. She forced herself to stand still as Harper casually unzipped the bag, rooting through it like a predator picking apart its prey. He pulled out the loaf of bread and turned it over, inspecting it as though it might be hiding something illegal. "Looks fine to me," he muttered, then tossed it back into the bag. The eggs came next, then the milk. He let the milk carton dangle from his fingers, and for a moment, Kesha thought he might drop it. She tensed, imagining the white liquid splattering across the pavement, ruining the one thing she'd spent her last few dollars on. But he didn't. Instead, he shoved it back into the bag and dropped the whole thing on the ground at her feet. "There. All good, right?" he said, his lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Kesha bent down to pick up the bag, her hands shaking. Behind her, she heard the distant rumble of an approaching car. She turned her head slightly, hoping, praying, that someone would stop, but the car sped past without slowing down. "You know what I think?" Harper said, circling her like a shark. "I think you're one of those kids who thinks they're too good to follow the rules, walking around with your fancy slogans on your shirt, acting like the world owes you something." Kesha's hands gripped the bag so tightly that the plastic handles dug into her palms. "I'm not acting like anything," she said softly, but the words only made Harper's smile widen. "Sure you are," he said. "You're acting like you can just waltz through this town without showing respect, like you don't have to answer to anyone." He took another step forward, and Kesha instinctively stepped back. Her foot hit a loose piece of gravel, and she stumbled, barely catching herself. Harper stopped, watching her with amusement. "Careful," he said, his voice mocking. "Wouldn't want to hurt yourself." Kesha wanted to run. Every muscle in her body screamed for her to turn and bolt, to put as much distance as possible between herself and this man. But she couldn't. She knew better. Running would only make it worse. Instead, she stood her ground, swallowing the fear rising in her throat. "Can I go now?" she asked. Harper's smirk faded, replaced by a hard, flat look. "Not so fast," he said. "You think you can talk to me like that, after I just let you off easy?" Kesha froze. "Let me off?" "You heard me," he interrupted. "Far as I'm concerned, you're already guilty. Maybe I decide to bring you in anyway. Teach you a little lesson about what happens when you mouth off to the law." "No," Kesha whispered, her heart pounding. Harper reached for the handcuffs on his belt. The world seemed to tilt. Kesha's breath came fast and shallow as panic clawed at her chest. She tried to take a step back, but her legs wouldn't move. Harper's fingers closed around the cuffs. The sound of metal clicking together sent a jolt of fear through her. And then, suddenly, there was another sound. The low growl of an engine. Harper paused, his eyes flicking past Kesha to the black SUV that had just pulled into the parking lot. Kesha turned too, her pulse still racing. The driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in dark jeans and a leather jacket, his sunglasses catching the sunlight. Kesha blinked. Was that? Her stomach flipped as recognition hit her. It was Tom Cruise. She'd seen his movies, of course, everyone had. But seeing him in person, here in the middle of nowhere, felt surreal. For the first time since Harper had approached her, Kesha felt something other than fear. Hope. The sheriff's mouth tightened, and for the first time he looked uneasy. Tom Cruise took a step closer, his gaze locking onto Harper's. And in that moment, Kesha saw it. The shift. The sheriff might have had the badge, the gun, and the power of his office. But Tom Cruise had something else. Presence. And for the first time, Harper didn't look so sure of himself. Kesha's heart raced as the man stepped out of the black SUV, his silhouette cutting sharply against the hazy, heat-soaked horizon. The sound of the door closing behind him was crisp, final, and it sent a ripple through the suffocating stillness that had hung over the parking lot like a storm cloud. Tom Cruise moved with deliberate ease, the kind of confidence that didn't need to be announced. He didn't rush, didn't flinch, and yet every step seemed to carry weight. Kesha blinked, half convinced she was imagining things. The sheriff stiffened. For the first time, his posture shifted, just slightly, but enough for Kesha to notice. The smug ease that had radiated from him moments earlier began to fracture. "Everything all right here?" Tom's voice carried easily across the space between them, even and calm, but there was a sharpness beneath it, like a blade hidden inside silk. Harper turned slowly, angling his body away from Kesha, but keeping her in his peripheral vision. He planted his boots firmly in the gravel, his jaw tightening as he sized up the man approaching him. "This doesn't concern you," Harper said, his tone flat but carrying an edge of defensiveness. Tom didn't break stride. "Sure looks like it does," he said, his gaze shifting briefly to Kesha before returning to Harper. "You okay?" Kesha's mouth went dry. She wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but her voice caught in her throat. Instead, she gave a shaky nod. "See?" Harper said, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "She's fine." Tom stopped a few feet away, just outside of Harper's reach, his hands resting loosely at his sides. He didn't look like a man spoiling for a fight, but there was something in his stance, a readiness, a coiled energy, that made it clear he wasn't going anywhere. "You sure about that?" Tom asked, tilting his head slightly. His sunglasses reflected the sheriff's face back at him, a perfect mirror of tension and irritation. "This is official business," Harper said, straightening his shoulders. "You should move along." "Official business," Tom repeated, his voice quiet but pointed. Funny, it looked more like intimidation to me. The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Harper's face darkened. "You don't know what you're talking about," Harper snapped. "I know what I saw," Tom replied, his tone unshaken. He turned slightly, his gaze falling to the scattered groceries still lying at Kesha's feet. A slow breath escaped him as he looked back at Harper. "Let me guess," Tom said, his voice edged with steel. "She fit the description, right?" Kesha's stomach twisted. She knew that phrase, knew it too well. It was the same excuse they had given for what happened to Jamal. Harper's face flushed. "You don't know this girl," he said, jabbing a finger in Kesha's direction. "You don't know what kind of trouble she—" "Stop," Tom interrupted. His voice was still calm, but the single word cut through the sheriff's bluster like a knife. Kesha felt the air shift. She had seen that kind of confidence before, in movies, on television, but this wasn't a role. This was real, and it hit differently. Harper opened his mouth to speak, but Tom stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "I'm going to make this very simple," Tom said. "You're done here, you're going to step back, and you're going to let her go." Harper didn't move. For a moment, Kesha thought he might actually draw his gun. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on, but then Harper hesitated. It was only a flicker, barely noticeable, but it was enough. Tom didn't press. He didn't threaten. He just stood there, unyielding, and Kesha saw the doubt creep into Harper's eyes. "This isn't over," Harper muttered finally, stepping back. His voice was quieter now, almost unsure. He shot Kesha one last glare before turning and walking toward his patrol car. The sound of his boots crunching against the gravel seemed impossibly loud. Kesha's knees threatened to buckle, but she held herself upright, forcing her breathing to steady as Harper climbed into his car and slammed the door. Tom waited, his eyes never leaving the patrol car until it reversed out of the parking lot and disappeared down the road. Only then did he turn back to Kesha. "You sure you're okay?" he asked. Kesha nodded, but the truth was she wasn't sure at all. Her hands still shook, and her legs felt like they might give out at any moment. Tom must have noticed because he crouched down and started gathering the groceries that had spilled across the ground. "Here," he said, placing the items carefully back into the bag before handing it to her. "Thanks," Kesha mumbled, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom didn't push. He just stood, watching her with a calm, steady gaze. "You live around here?" he asked after a moment. Kesha hesitated, then nodded. "Not far," she said. Tom looked down the road, then back at her. "How about I walk you home?" Kesha's first instinct was to refuse. She didn't want to seem weak, but the thought of walking the rest of the way alone, knowing Harper could come back, made her hesitate. "Okay," she said quietly. Tom nodded and gestured for her to lead the way. As they started walking, Kesha felt some of the tension begin to drain from her shoulders, but the fear lingered, coiled tight in her chest. She glanced up at Tom as they walked, wondering how someone like him, someone famous, someone untouchable, could end up here, stepping in to protect a girl he didn't even know. And why had Harper backed down? Questions swirled in her mind, but she didn't ask them. Not yet. Instead, she focused on putting one foot in front of the other, the sound of Tom's steady footsteps beside her grounding her as they moved further and further from the gas station. But even as the distance grew, Kesha couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not yet. The sound of their footsteps echoed faintly in Kesha's ears as they moved away from the gas station. Gravel crunched beneath Tom's boots, steady and deliberate, a rhythm that somehow calmed her nerves despite the fear still coiled tightly in her chest. She clutched the grocery bag to her side like a lifeline, her fingers aching from gripping it so hard. Tom walked slightly behind her, letting her lead the way, but his presence felt protective, like a shield between her and the threat that had just driven off moments ago. Kesha kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, but she couldn't stop her thoughts from circling back to what had just happened. Sheriff Harper wasn't the kind of man to let something like this go. She had seen the anger in his face, the way his jaw clenched when Tom had stood up to him. The humiliation of being challenged, especially by someone as famous and untouchable as Tom Cruise, would only make him more dangerous. And he wouldn't forget. She felt Tom's gaze flicker toward her as they walked, but he didn't say anything right away. He gave her space, letting the silence settle before finally breaking it. "You handled that well," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Kept your head." Kesha swallowed, unsure how to respond. She didn't feel like she had kept her head at all. Her hands were still shaking and her chest was tight, like there wasn't enough air. "I was scared," she admitted quietly. "That's normal," Tom said. "You can be scared and still do the right thing. That's what matters." His words should have comforted her, but instead they made her stomach twist. She wasn't sure what the right thing even was anymore. Was it walking away like her mom always told her, or was it standing her ground, even when it felt impossible? She opened her mouth to say something, but before she could, the low growl of an engine shattered the quiet. Kesha froze. The sound came from behind them, faint but growing louder. She turned her head just enough to see a familiar shape rolling up the road. Harper's patrol car. The sheriff wasn't done. Tom stopped beside her, his stance shifting ever so slightly. It was subtle, just a shift of weight, a slight tension in his shoulders, but it felt like the air around him changed. The car slowed as it approached, the tires crackling against loose gravel before coming to a stop a few yards away. The door opened, and Harper stepped out. This time he wasn't alone. 2 other deputies followed, younger men in crisp uniforms, but their eyes carried the same hardness as Harper's. Kesha's breath caught. Tom stepped forward, positioning himself between Kesha and the approaching officers. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon," Tom said, his voice level but firm. Harper's eyes flickered with something dark. "You think you can just walk in here and tell me how to do my job?" the sheriff snapped. "I think I just stopped you from abusing your badge," Tom replied. Harper's lips curled into a sneer. "You don't belong here," he said. "You don't know how things work in this town." Tom didn't flinch. "I know enough," he said. Kesha's pulse raced. She could see the tension building between them, the way Harper's hands twitched at his sides like he was daring Tom to make the first move. One of the deputies took a step closer, his hand resting on the baton at his belt. Tom's eyes flicked to the movement, sharp and calculating, but he didn't back down. "This doesn't have to go any further," Tom said. "We both know you don't want this on camera." Harper's face flushed red. "You think you can threaten me?" he spat. "This isn't Hollywood. Nobody cares what you do out here." Tom took a slow breath. "No threats," he said. "Just facts." The deputies moved closer and Kesha felt her stomach drop. She could feel it coming, the moment when words wouldn't be enough anymore. Harper's hand dropped to his belt, and in a single motion, he pulled out his baton. Tom didn't wait. Before Harper could bring it up, Tom stepped in, grabbing the sheriff's wrist and twisting sharply. The baton clattered to the ground as Harper staggered back, cursing. One of the deputies lunged, but Tom sidestepped, catching the man's arm and flipping him over his shoulder in a fluid motion. The deputy hit the ground hard, groaning in pain. The second deputy hesitated, clearly unsure, but Tom didn't give him a chance to act. He turned sharply, delivering a quick strike to the man's knee, sending him stumbling. Kesha could hardly breathe. It was like watching one of his action scenes unfold in real life, but there were no cameras, no stunt doubles. This was real. Harper recovered, his face twisted in rage. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," he snarled, reaching for his gun. Tom's eyes darkened. "Don't," he said. For a moment, everything froze. Kesha's heart pounded as Harper's fingers brushed the handle of the gun, but something in Tom's voice stopped him. Harper hesitated, and in that hesitation the fight drained out of him. Tom stepped closer. "You need to think very carefully about your next move," he said quietly. Harper's hand fell away from the gun. "This isn't over," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. Tom didn't respond. He just stood there, steady and unyielding, until Harper finally turned and stormed back to his car. The deputies followed, one limping and the other clutching his arm. The patrol car roared to life and sped off down the road. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then Kesha let out a shaky breath, her legs threatening to give out beneath her. Tom turned to her, his expression softening. "You okay?" Kesha nodded, but the truth was, she didn't know. Tom crouched down and picked up her groceries again, handing them back to her. "We should keep moving," he said gently. Kesha swallowed and nodded again, her grip tightening around the bag as they started walking. But even as they left the gas station and the fight behind them, Kesha knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The walk back toward Kesha's neighborhood felt heavier now. The tension from the confrontation lingered in the air like the suffocating heat of the afternoon. Tom walked beside her, his movements steady, but Kesha couldn't shake the feeling that trouble was far from over. Her heart still hammered in her chest, and the echo of Harper's venomous voice rang in her ears. "This isn't over." Those words clung to her thoughts like a stain, refusing to be scrubbed away. She kept her head down, focusing on each step, but her mind raced. The fight had been quick, almost too quick, and now she felt the weight of everything that could have gone wrong. What if Harper had pulled his gun? What if Tom hadn't been there? She glanced at him as they walked. His face was calm, but his eyes scanned the horizon, alert. She could tell he was still on edge, ready for something more. "Thank you," Kesha said quietly, breaking the silence. Tom glanced down at her and gave a small nod. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "You didn't deserve what happened back there." Kesha swallowed, her throat tight. She hesitated, then forced the words out. "I don't think he's done." Tom's jaw tightened. "Probably not," he admitted. "Guys like that don't like being told no." Kesha shivered, despite the heat. By the time they reached her street, Kesha's legs felt like lead. Her neighborhood was small, rows of single-story houses, most of them with peeling paint and overgrown yards. It wasn't much, but it was home. Tom followed her to the front door, but before she could open it, the low rumble of an engine made her stomach drop. A police cruiser rolled slowly down the street. Not Harper this time, another deputy, his expression guarded as he looked out the window. Tom stepped slightly closer to Kesha, shielding her. The cruiser didn't stop, but the message was clear. They were being watched. Tom waited until the car disappeared around the corner before speaking. "You should go inside," he said. "Stay with your family. I'll handle this." Kesha hesitated. "What are you going to do?" Tom met her eyes. "What I have to." Then he turned and walked back toward the main road, leaving Kesha staring after him. Tom's boots crunched against the gravel as he made his way toward the sheriff's station. He didn't know this town, had only stopped here by chance, but something about what he'd seen stuck with him. The look in that girl's eyes. He had seen it before, on movie sets, during charity work, and in places far darker than this town. Fear, helplessness, and the simmering anger of someone who had been pushed too far but didn't have the power to push back. He wasn't about to let that stand. The sheriff's station sat at the edge of town, a squat building with faded paint and a cracked front step. Tom pushed through the front door and the room fell silent. Deputies turned to look at him, some confused, others wary. Behind the desk, Harper rose slowly to his feet. "Well, look who decided to show up," Harper said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Tom didn't respond. He walked straight up to the desk and stopped. "We need to talk." Harper leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "I don't think we do," he said. "Matter of fact, I think you need to get out of my town before things get real uncomfortable for you." Tom's eyes didn't waver. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "Not until this stops." Harper's face darkened. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he spat. "You think you can come in here, throw your weight around, and make everything better?" Tom leaned in slightly, his voice low and steady. "No," he said. "I think I can make sure you don't hurt anyone else." Harper's hands clenched into fists. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," he said. Tom didn't flinch. "Maybe," he said, "but I'm not the one who's going to regret it." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Harper took the bait. It happened fast. Harper lunged, but Tom was faster. He sidestepped, catching Harper's arm and twisting it behind his back in one smooth motion. The sheriff cursed, struggling, but Tom didn't let go. Deputies scrambled, but no one moved to help Harper. They had seen enough to know when a fight was lost. By the time it was over, Harper was on the floor, handcuffed and seething. "This is assault," he shouted. "You'll pay for this." Tom didn't answer. He turned to the deputies. "Call it in," he said. "Get someone down here who isn't part of this mess." For a moment, no one moved. Then one of the younger deputies, maybe barely out of training, nodded and reached for the phone. Harper's shouts faded into the background as Tom stepped outside. The crowd had already started to gather, people with phones, taking pictures and recording. And standing at the edge of it all was Kesha. Her eyes met Tom's, and for the first time, she smiled. The fallout came quickly. Harper was taken into custody, and an investigation into his conduct began almost immediately. Witnesses came forward, videos surfaced, and suddenly the story wasn't just local anymore. News vans rolled into town, reporters asked questions, and Kesha found herself in the middle of it all. She didn't know how to handle the attention at first. People called her brave, but she didn't feel brave. She just felt relieved. But as the days passed, that relief turned into something else. Determination. She saw the impact her story had, how it gave other people the courage to speak up, and she realized that this was just the beginning. Tom left town before the media circus reached its peak. Kesha didn't get a chance to thank him properly, but she knew he wouldn't want the attention. He had done what he came to do. And now it was her turn. The afternoon sun hung lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement in front of the sheriff's station. Kesha stood at the edge of the growing crowd, clutching the strap of her backpack as people murmured and whispered, their phones raised to capture the scene unfolding before them. It felt surreal, like watching a movie play out in real time, except this wasn't fiction, and there was no guarantee of a happy ending. Sheriff Roy Harper, the man who had terrorized her just hours earlier, sat slumped in the back seat of a patrol car, his face red and glistening with sweat. His hands were cuffed and his eyes burned with humiliation as deputies stood awkwardly nearby, unsure of what to do next. Tom Cruise stood a few feet away, his stance calm but firm, as though none of this chaos fazed him. The crowd had already begun to recognize him, whispers spreading like wildfire. Some people stared while others recorded, their voices a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Is that really him? What's he doing here? I can't believe he took down the sheriff." Kesha barely heard them. Her heart still pounded from everything that had happened. Her fingers gripped the strap of her bag so tightly it hurt, but she didn't let go. Not yet. Tom turned and met her eyes through the crowd. For a moment, everything else seemed to fade. She saw something in his expression, reassurance, maybe, or understanding, and it steadied her just enough to draw a shaky breath. The flashing lights of more police cars and news vans lit up the street as reinforcements arrived. their radios crackling and voices overlapping. Officers from outside the town stepped out of their vehicles, their uniforms sharper, their eyes more focused. These weren't Harper's men. They were outsiders, here to take over. Kesha felt the tension shift. For the first time in what felt like hours, she exhaled. Tom walked toward her, his steps measured but purposeful. When he reached her, he crouched slightly so their eyes were level. "You okay?" he asked. Kesha nodded, but the weight in her chest lingered. "Are you sure?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "I don't know." Tom didn't push, he just nodded. "It's normal to feel that way," he said. "What happened today, it's big, and it's not over yet." Kesha looked past him at Harper, who was still glaring out the window of the patrol car as if he could will his way out of the situation. She shuddered. "What if he comes back?" she asked quietly. Tom's expression hardened. "He won't," he said. "Not after this." Kesha wanted to believe him. She really did, but part of her couldn't shake the doubt. The aftermath unraveled quickly. By the time Kesha got home that evening, the story had already hit social media. Videos of Tom confronting Harper, of the sheriff being handcuffed and led away, were spreading like wildfire. News anchors dissected every frame, and hashtags began trending. #Justice for Kesha, #Hero in Hollywood, and #Corrupt Sheriff Exposed. Kesha sat in the living room with her mom, the television glowing in the dim light as commentators speculated about what would happen next. Her mom reached over and took her hand, squeezing it tightly. "You were so brave," she said softly. Kesha didn't feel brave. Her stomach still twisted every time she thought about Harper's face, the way he'd looked at her like she was less than nothing. But she didn't say that. She just squeezed her mom's hand back and nodded. The days that followed were a blur. Journalists knocked on the door, reporters called. Kesha's mom turned them all away, but the attention didn't stop. Kesha's name was everywhere, on the news, in articles, even on talk shows. People called her a hero, but she didn't feel like one. All she'd done was survive. Tom Cruise, on the other hand, seemed to disappear. He left town the day after Harper's arrest, slipping away before the media frenzy reached its peak. Kesha wondered if he'd planned it that way, to make sure the spotlight stayed on the truth and not on him. She thought about him a lot in the days that followed, about the way he'd stepped in without hesitation, about the calm certainty in his voice when he'd faced down Harper and his deputies, and about the way he'd looked at her, as if she mattered. A week later, Kesha stood in front of the courthouse, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the microphone. The crowd in front of her stretched down the steps and into the street, faces she didn't recognize but who all seemed to know her. She glanced at her mom, who gave her an encouraging nod, and then at her sisters, who smiled up at her with wide eyes. Kesha took a breath. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice steady despite the nerves churning inside her. "This is about everyone who's ever been told to stay quiet, to keep their head down, to just survive." She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd. "My brother didn't get justice," she continued, "but I'm going to fight to make sure no one else has to go through what he did, what I did." The crowd erupted into applause, but Kesha barely heard it. She felt lighter, like something heavy had finally lifted off her shoulders. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was fighting. In the weeks that followed, Kesha's life changed. She started volunteering at a local community center, helping other kids who felt like they didn't have a voice. She poured herself into her schoolwork, determined to follow through on her dream of becoming a lawyer. And every time she felt doubt creeping in, She thought about Tom Cruise, about the way he'd face down Harper without flinching. One evening, as she sorted books at the community center, her phone buzzed. She glanced down at the screen, her breath catching when she saw the name. Tom Cruise. She opened the message. "Keep fighting. I'm proud of you." Kesha smiled. She didn't know if she'd ever see him again, but that didn't matter. He'd already given her something she'd never had before. Hope. And that was enough. Thank you for watching this video. If you like this story, please support the channel by subscribing so you don't miss new episodes. Like and share this video with your friends. Let this story be seen by as many people as possible. Watch other videos on the channel. There are even more exciting and important stories. Your views help us tell new stories. Thank you for your support.